Good evening. You're watching Inside News. I'm Alexa. Tonight, we bring you an in-depth special report from the Indian Ocean, where the island nation of Madagascar has entered one of the most turbulent periods in its modern history. In October 2025, a wave of public unrest, born from economic despair and the failure of basic state services, escalated into a full-scale political upheaval that ended the presidency of Andry Rajoelina. What began as a youth-led protest over power outages transformed into a nationwide revolt that reshaped the country's leadership, its institutions, and its future. We trace the chain of events that led to this dramatic regime change, unpack the forces driving it, and assess what lies ahead for Madagascar and the region. In October 2025, Madagascar, a vast island nation in the Indian Ocean, witnessed a dramatic and rapid regime change. Within weeks, the presidency of Andry Rajoelina collapsed under the weight of a youth-driven uprising that exposed the depth of the country's social and economic fractures. This crisis was not the result of a sudden coup, but rather a long accumulating pressure of systemic failure. A digitally organized generation of young citizens, calling themselves Gen Z Madagascar, led the protests that began on September 25th. Their initial anger was directed at the chronic failures of electricity and water supply, basic utilities that had become symbols of national dysfunction. But what began as a protest against power cuts quickly transformed into a movement against poverty, corruption, and the decay of public institutions. The government's heavy-handed response, including the use of live ammunition against demonstrators, intensified public anger. Within 2 weeks, the movement gained unstoppable momentum. The decisive moment came on October 12th, when the Elite Army Personnel Administration Center, known as CAPSAT, defected and sided with the protesters. The same military unit that had once brought Rajoelina to power in 2009 now turned against him. Within 48 hours, the president fled the country. The National Assembly impeached him for abandoning his post. The military, led by CAPSAT commander Colonel Michael Randrianirina, seized control of the state. The constitution was suspended. Civil institutions were dissolved, and a 2-year transitional rule under military leadership was declared. While the streets of Antananarivo celebrated the fall of a government many saw as corrupt and ineffective, the international community moved swiftly to condemn the military takeover. The African Union suspended Madagascar, and foreign governments froze assistance, leaving the country at a precarious crossroads. The downfall of Andry Rajoelina was years in the making. Beneath the surface of apparent stability, public frustration had been building over poverty, unemployment, and the visible collapse of essential services. What finally triggered open revolt was the failure of the most basic state functions: electricity and water. On September 25, 2025, demonstrations began in the capital and quickly spread nationwide. The trigger was daily power cuts lasting up to 12 hours and widespread water shortages that crippled homes and businesses. For a population where 3 out of 4 citizens live in poverty, these were not minor inconveniences. They symbolized a state that had stopped functioning. A protester was quoted saying, "If Malagasy children are studying in darkness, where will the future of this nation be?" The failures of Jarama, the state utility, became a rallying point. Citizens saw corruption and nepotism behind every blackout and dry tap. The inability to provide basic needs erased what remained of the government's legitimacy. Political scientists later described this as the collapse of infrastructural legitimacy, the state's ability to earn authority through service delivery. When the lights went out, the government's authority did too. Into this vacuum stepped Gen Z Madagascar, a decentralized, digitally connected youth movement. organized primarily through encrypted channels like Discord and Signal. They coordinated actions across regions while using Instagram and Facebook to amplify their message. Their tactics were global, inspired by youth-led movements in Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. Their emblem was the pirate flag from the Japanese anime One Piece, a pop culture symbol of rebellion against unjust authority. Initially, their message was simple: restore electricity and water. But within days, their demands expanded into a manifesto for systemic change, an end to corruption, nepotism, and mismanagement, and ultimately the resignation of President Rajoelina. When the president offered dialogue, Gen Z Madagascar rejected it outright, declaring, "We do not reach out to a regime that every day crushes those who stand up for justice." This uprising revealed a defining feature of modern unrest: digital organization colliding with analog state failure. Even in one of the world's poorest countries, global information access had created expectations far beyond what the government could deliver. The gap between what people saw online and what they lived in reality became politically explosive. Governments without the capacity to meet those expectations were now vulnerable to digitally fueled movements capable of rapid mobilization and narrative control. The government's reaction to the protests was immediate and forceful. Security forces were deployed across the capital, firing tear gas, rubber bullets, and eventually live rounds. The United Nations reported at least 22 civilians killed and over 100 injured in the first week. The government claimed the number was only 12, describing the dead as looters and vandals. This denial backfired, deepening public anger. The administration's credibility disintegrated. Civil society groups, students, and trade unions joined the demonstrations. Nightly curfews were imposed, but the streets remained filled. The unrest had evolved beyond control, becoming a national uprising. The stage was set for confrontation between a collapsing civilian government and a restless military apparatus watching events unfold. Over 3 tense weeks, Madagascar's political order unraveled. September 25th, youth-led protests begin. September 29th, Rajoelina dissolves his government, hoping to calm the streets. October 6th, a military general, Rufin Zafisambo, is appointed prime minister. October 11th, the Senate president, a key ally, is removed. October 12th, the elite CAPSAT unit defects and joins protesters. October 13th, Rajoelina flees, addressing the nation from an undisclosed location. October 14th, Parliament impeaches him for abandoning his post. October 15th, the African Union suspends Madagascar. October 17th, Colonel Michael Randrianarina prepares to assume power. Facing nationwide protests, Rajoelina attempted damage control. He fired his energy minister, dissolved his cabinet, and brought a general into government to secure the loyalty of the army. Each move failed. Protesters dismissed them as cosmetic. The call for his resignation grew louder. By October 11th, even his allies in the Senate began turning against him, signaling that the political establishment had lost confidence. On October 12th, history repeated itself. The CAPSAT unit, the sane elite corps that had supported Rajoelina's rise in 2009, switched sides. In an unprecedented display, CAPSAT soldiers drove their armored vehicles into the capital, joining demonstrators at May 13 Square, a historic site of Malagasy uprisings. Their commanders issued a statement. They would not fire on their brothers and sisters. They declared control over the armed forces and installed General Demostene Pikulas as new chief of staff. This effectively ended Rajoelina's command. clashes between loyalist gendarmes and mutinous soldiers left one CAPSAT member dead, but the defection's outcome was decisive. The presidency was finished. With his support gone, Rajoelina fled the capital on October 13. From an undisclosed location, he released a pre-recorded address claiming an assassination plot had forced him into hiding. He refused to resign and called for dialogue. Few were listening. The following day, he issued a decree dissolving the National Assembly in a desperate attempt to block impeachment. Lawmakers defied him, calling the act unconstitutional. Backed by the military, they impeached him for abandoning his post. The move was symbolic but politically decisive. Within hours, CAPSAT commander Colonel Michael Rajoelina appeared on national television. Flanked by uniformed officers, he announced that the military had seized power and suspended the constitution. Rajoelina's government ceased to exist. The coup did not overthrow a stable government. It filled a void left by a leader who had lost both civilian and military legitimacy. For Madagascar, it marked a return to a pattern long embedded in its political life: the military stepping in as the final arbiter of power. The 2025 coup in Madagascar was not driven by ideology, but by the convergence of three forces: a president whose political survival depended on military favor, a colonel who had long opposed him, and an elite unit that once again decided the country's future. Andry Rajoelina, born May 30th, 1974, was a media entrepreneur before entering politics. He first rose to prominence as a DJ and event promoter, later building a broadcasting company that became a key platform for his political messaging. In 2007, he was elected mayor of Antananarivo, appealing to young voters under his movement, Tenora Malagasy Venona, meaning determined Malagasy youth. His rise to national power came through crisis. In 2009, he led a popular movement that toppled President Marc Ravalomanana with the backing of the same CAPSAT military unit that would later end his own rule. The international community condemned that coup, but Rajoelina maintained power as head of a transitional authority until 2014. After being barred from the 2013 elections, he returned and won the 2018 presidential vote, followed by re-election in 2023 amid an opposition boycott. His second term was marred by controversy. Public anger deepened after revelations of his French dual nationality. Critics accused him of being disconnected from ordinary Malagasy citizens and too closely aligned with French interests. As poverty worsened and corruption scandals multiplied, Rajoelina's political capital evaporated. By 2025, he faced mass resentment from both the public and sections of the armed forces. He was a leader whose rise and fall were bound to the same military force. His authority was never absolute. It was conditional, borrowed from the barracks. When the army withdrew its support, his presidency ended overnight. The man now leading Madagascar is Colonel Michael Rajoelina, a senior commander within the CAPSAT unit. He is not new to opposition. Reports indicate that he had previously been imprisoned in 2023 for allegedly plotting against Rajoelina's administration. His open criticism of corruption within the armed forces earned him both followers and enemies. Upon taking power, Rajoelina presented himself as a reluctant savior. He insisted that this was not a coup, but an act of responsibility to prevent the nation's collapse. He claimed his authority was granted by an invitation from the High Constitutional Court, even as he suspended that same court's functions. This contradiction served a purpose: to construct a veneer of legality for international audiences while asserting total military control at home. He promised an 18 to 24-month transition, constitutional reform, and eventual elections. Whether these commitments will be honored remains uncertain. At the center of both the 2009 and 2025 coups stands CAPSAT, the Corps d'Administration des Personnels et des Services Administratifs et Techniques. Based on the outskirts of Antananarivo, CAPSAT is a small but powerful elite corps that has repeatedly determined Madagascar's political trajectory. In 2009, it withdrew loyalty from President Rajoelina and installed Rajoelina. 16 years later, it did the same to Rajoelina himself. Its role transcends traditional military duty. CAPSAT acts as a political arbiter, stepping in when civilian leadership loses legitimacy. It has become, in effect, the ultimate guarantor of state authority in Madagascar, not through the ballot box, but through coercive power. Beneath the political upheaval lies a deeper story: the slow decay of the Malagasy state and economy. The October 2025 crisis did not emerge in isolation. It was the final expression of decades of weak governance, deep inequality, and systemic poverty. Madagascar remains one of the world's poorest countries. According to World Bank data, roughly 75% of its 30 million citizens live below the poverty line. In 2021, the rate of extreme poverty stood near 69%, with living standards in cities declining even faster than in rural areas. The economy is dominated by low-productivity agriculture and a fragile service sector. Infrastructure is underdeveloped, and formal employment is scarce. Youth unemployment is widespread, feeding frustration among the same generation that would later lead the protests. By late 2025, inflation had surpassed 9%, and economic growth had stalled. An IMF mission shortly before the coup warned of rising fiscal pressure and weak tax collection. For millions of Malagasy, these macroeconomic indicators translated into daily hardship: joblessness, blackouts, and rising food costs. The Rajoelina administration faced pervasive allegations of corruption. Protesters accused senior officials of embezzling public funds and awarding contracts to allies. Transparency International's 2024 Corruption Perceptions Index ranked Madagascar 140th out of 180 nations. Despite the country's wealth in natural resources, including vanilla, gemstones, and minerals, the benefits remained concentrated among a small political and business elite. For most citizens, state power became synonymous with private enrichment. The sense that the system was rigged became a powerful unifying grievance. The coup itself has worsened an already fragile economy. International donors froze or delayed funding. The World Bank postponed new loans pending clarity on governance. The IMF's reform programs were suspended. One of those programs aimed to rescue the state-owned utility Jirama, the same company whose failures sparked the protests. Its reform is now uncertain, creating a feedback loop in which political instability undermines the very systems that need repair. Tourism, a key source of foreign currency, collapsed after airlines suspended flights and governments issued travel warnings. Mining, another strategic sector, faces major risk. Madagascar holds deposits of graphite, nickel, and cobalt, minerals critical for the global energy transition. Ongoing instability could disrupt international supply chains and deter investment. The result is a shrinking economy with fewer allies, an isolated regime facing a population that expects rapid improvement. A military takeover in Madagascar triggered swift international reaction. While the new rulers gained popular support at home, they faced near unanimous condemnation abroad. On October 15, 2025, one day after the coup, the African Union convened an emergency session. It voted to suspend Madagascar from all AU activities with immediate effect, signing an unconstitutional change of government. The Southern African Development Community, SAD, also expressed concern. Ironically, Rajoelina had been serving as its rotating chairperson at the time of his ouster. Observers warned that the coup reinforced a pattern of democratic backsliding in Africa, aligning Madagascar with countries such as Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Guinea, which have also experienced military takeovers in recent years. Analysts within the AU face a recurring dilemma: condemning coups while ignoring the failures that provoke them. The strong popular support for Madagascar's military intervention risks undermining the AU's credibility as a defender of democratic governance. United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres declared he was deeply concerned by the unconstitutional change of power and called for restraint. France, Madagascar's former colonial power, expressed great concern. Yet Paris found itself in a politically delicate position amid reports, never officially confirmed, that Rajoelina had fled aboard a French military aircraft, possibly to reunion of French territory. This perception of French involvement intensified anti-French sentiment among protesters, who derided the ousted president as a colonial puppet. The United States issued travel warnings, advising citizens to remain indoors. Germany called for dialogue. Russia urged caution. The international consensus was clear: restore constitutional order, but avoid escalation. Inside Madagascar, the tone was markedly different. Crowds in Antananarivo cheered the CAPSAT soldiers. The military was viewed as liberators from a corrupt political class. A protest leader said, "The military is listening to us. The current state of affairs gives us reason to be confident." Yet some activists warned of a new form of authoritarianism. The enthusiasm of victory could easily mask the emergence of another unelected regime. From exile, Rajoelina denounced the military's action as an illegal declaration and insisted he remained the legitimate president. His claims carried little weight. The gendarmerie soon admitted faults and excesses in its crackdown, aligning itself with the new leadership. By mid-October, the military held uncontested control of the state. For the Malagasy people, the fall of Rajoelina represented both relief and uncertainty, an end to one crisis and the beginning of another. The next phase would test whether the new rulers could stabilize the nation or repeat the cycles of coups and transitions that have defined Madagascar's modern history. By late October 2025, Madagascar had entered a new political chapter under military rule. The institutions of civilian governance were suspended. The constitution was frozen. Power rested in the hands of the National Military Committee for the Safeguard of the Nation, led by Colonel Michael Randrianarina. The committee announced a 2-year transition period with promises of reform, a new constitution, and elections by 2027. But details remain opaque. Randrianarina's televised addresses follow a consistent theme: national unity, anti-corruption, and the restoration of state authority. He presents himself as a guardian of the people rather than a ruler. Yet the mechanisms of accountability under his command remain undefined. The suspension of Parliament and the judiciary effectively transferred all decision-making to the military. Civil servants now report directly to military governors. Independent media face tighter restrictions. Journalists covering protests or criticizing the new order have reported intimidation and brief detentions. Human rights organizations warn that the language of national restoration could justify prolonged military control. The transitional charter remains unpublished. No clear timeline exists for restoring civilian institutions. Nevertheless, the military's popularity among the youth remains high. The same digital networks that coordinated protests now broadcast messages of national reconstruction and volunteer efforts to repair public infrastructure. The alliance between the military and Gen Z Madagascar gives the junta temporary legitimacy. Its durability depends on whether tangible improvements follow. The immediate challenge for the new authorities is economic recovery. With donor funds frozen and public confidence low, the administration faces a liquidity crisis. The Finance Committee announced emergency austerity measures, suspension of foreign travel for officials, audit of all state contracts, and temporary price controls on fuel and rice. The World Bank and IMF have demanded a clear transition roadmap before resuming engagement. Without external financing, Madagascar risks defaulting on public salaries and import obligations. Andry Rajoelina has turned to private mining companies to negotiate advance payments on export royalties, a move economists describe as risky but necessary to maintain short-term stability. Inflation remains high. Food insecurity affects nearly half the population. Yet, despite hardship, the political calm following the coup has allowed markets to reopen and limited public services to resume. The 2025 crisis underscored the growing role of digital platforms in shaping Madagascar's political landscape. For the first time, social media movements dictated national narratives faster than traditional media could respond. Gen Z Madagascar used memes, live streams, and AI-generated imagery to ridicule the regime and unify protesters under shared symbols. Since the coup, the military has sought to control this digital space. A new cybersecurity bureau monitors online content under the pretext of preventing destabilizing propaganda. Analysts warn this could evolve into systematic censorship. The generational shift is evident. While the military governs through conventional authority, its survival partly depends on the goodwill of an online public that measures legitimacy in transparency, not hierarchy. Madagascar's geopolitical posture remains delicate. Regional powers have adopted a wait-and-see approach. The African Union maintains its suspension, but has avoided sanctions to prevent further isolation. SADC dispatched a diplomatic mission to Antananarivo, urging a credible timeline for elections. France's role remains contentious. While officially distancing itself from the coup, it maintains significant commercial interests in energy and logistics. Anti-French sentiment persists, though the military has avoided direct confrontation. China and India, both expanding their presence in the Indian Ocean, have moved cautiously to protect investments. Beijing's statement emphasized stability and continuity of cooperation. For now, international actors view Madagascar through a pragmatic lens, too strategically positioned to ignore, too fragile to destabilize further. Beneath the political and diplomatic maneuvering lies a society exhausted by crisis. The protests left hundreds dead or injured, and thousands displaced by violence and looting. Hospitals and schools continue to face shortages of supplies and personnel. Humanitarian agencies warn of rising malnutrition rates and a resurgence of rural insecurity as state control weakens outside the capital. Yet amid despair, civic activism remains strong. Youth collectives are organizing food distribution drives and reconstruction campaigns. Religious institutions play a stabilizing role, mediating between military authorities and local communities. The spirit that fueled the uprising persists, now focused on rebuilding rather than revolt. Analysts identify three possible outcomes for Madagascar's transition. First, a successful stabilization under military supervision, followed by a gradual return to civilian rule. This would mirror models seen in Chad and Sudan's early transitions, though both later faltered. Second, a slide into permanent military dominance, where elections serve to legitimize the status quo rather than restore democracy. Third, renewed unrest if promises of reform and accountability remain unmet. Each scenario depends on the military's capacity to manage expectations while maintaining cohesion. The history of Malagasy politics suggests that disillusionment could reignite the same forces that brought down Rajoelina. For now, Colonel Randrianira remains the pivotal figure. To his supporters, he represents justice and renewal. To his critics, he embodies the repetition of a cycle: military power rising whenever civilian authority collapses. What happens next will determine whether Madagascar's latest revolution marks a turning point or another chapter in its long struggle between hope and instability. That was our special report on Madagascar's 2025 crisis. An uprising that began in the streets, fractured the state, and redrew the political map of a nation long caught between instability and renewal. As the new military council consolidates power and pledges a transition to civilian rule, the world watches to see whether Madagascar can reclaim democratic governance or slide deeper into uncertainty. For Inside News, I'm Alexa. Thank you for watching.